There exists a profound paradox in our political culture. Those who claim the greatest certainty about complex social questions often possess the least understanding of their true complexity. We live in an age where intellectual humility, the recognition that our knowledge is partial and provisional, has become almost a vice, while dogmatic certainty masquerades as wisdom. Yet from decades of observing the rise and fall of ideological systems, from witnessing the seductive power of totalitarian certainties and the resilience of democratic doubt, I have learned that uncertainty is not the enemy of knowledge, but its most reliable guardian. Today, we explore why methodological doubt represents not intellectual weakness, but the highest form of intellectual courage, and why American democracy depends on citizens who understand that admitting ignorance is often the beginning of wisdom. Chapter 1: The Epistemological Foundation of Democratic Life. Democratic societies rest upon a philosophical assumption that most of their citizens never consciously examine, the belief that truth emerges through debate rather than revelation, through process rather than proclamation. This assumption, seemingly modest, represents one of humanity's most audacious intellectual achievements. It suggests that no individual or group possesses such complete knowledge of complex social realities that they should be exempt from questioning, criticism, or the obligation to provide evidence for their claims. The totalitarian systems I witnessed throughout the 20th century all shared a common characteristic: they claimed access to a form of knowledge so certain, so complete, that it justified silencing all opposition. Whether this certainty derived from dialectical materialism, racial science, or revolutionary consciousness mattered less than the structure of certainty itself. These systems did not fail because their specific beliefs were wrong, though they were catastrophically wrong, but because they had immunized themselves against the corrective mechanisms that allow societies to learn from error. Consider how this operates in practice. When a democratic society confronts a complex challenge, economic inequality, immigration, technological disruption, the healthy response involves acknowledging what we do not know as clearly as what we do know. We might know that unemployment has risen, but we may not know which of several competing explanations best accounts for this rise. We might know that certain communities feel left behind by economic change, but we may not know which policies would most effectively address their concerns without creating unintended consequences elsewhere. This acknowledgement of uncertainty is not relativism. We are not claiming that all explanations are equally valid or that evidence cannot help us discriminate between better and worse hypotheses. Rather, we are recognizing that social phenomena emerge from the interaction of countless variables, many of which we cannot observe directly, and that our interventions in these systems will inevitably produce some outcomes we did not anticipate. The intellectual virtue that democracy requires, therefore, is not the confidence to provide definitive answers to every question, but the wisdom to distinguish between what we know with reasonable confidence and what remains genuinely uncertain. This distinction allows democratic debate to focus on areas where evidence can actually guide decision-making, while acknowledging the irreducible uncertainties that make political judgment, as opposed to technical calculation, necessary. Chapter 2: The Sociology of Intellectual Certainty. Why do intelligent people, faced with complex social realities, so often retreat into systems of thought that promise more certainty than these realities can actually provide? This question haunted me throughout my observations of intellectual life, particularly during the ideological upheavals that marked the middle decades of the 20th century. The answer, I believe, lies in understanding the social and psychological functions that certainty serves, functions that have little to do with the pursuit of truth. Intellectual systems that promise comprehensive explanations of social reality serve profound psychological needs. They reduce the anxiety that accompanies genuine uncertainty about important questions. They provide clear criteria for distinguishing between allies and enemies, between progress and reaction, between truth and falsehood. They offer their adherents a sense of historical significance, the feeling that they understand the fundamental forces shaping human destiny. Most importantly, they provide clear guides for action in situations where the costs of inaction seem unacceptably high. These psychological benefits help explain why intelligent people often cling to ideological systems even when empirical evidence challenges their core assumptions. The system provides benefits that transcend its explanatory accuracy. It offers meaning, community, and purpose, goods that human beings need but that empirical science, with its necessarily provisional and partial findings, cannot directly supply. Observe how this dynamic operates in contemporary American political discourse. Complex problems like healthcare costs, educational achievement gaps, or environmental protection become occasions for the deployment of comprehensive worldviews rather than careful empirical analysis. Each side possesses a framework that can assimilate any new information in ways that confirm its prior assumptions. Rising healthcare costs demonstrate either the failures of market mechanisms or the distortions introduced by government intervention, depending on which framework one brings to the data. The tragedy is not that people hold strong convictions. Democracy requires citizens willing to act on their beliefs, but that they mistake their frameworks for direct perception of reality. They forget that these frameworks are interpretive tools, useful for organizing experience but necessarily selective in what they highlight and what they obscure. The transition from "this framework has proven useful for understanding certain phenomena" to "this framework reveals the essential truth about social reality" represents a crucial intellectual error, one that immunizes believers against evidence that might improve their understanding. Democratic societies need institutions and practices that can harness the motivational power of strong convictions while maintaining space for the corrective mechanisms that empirical evidence provides. This requires cultivating citizens who can hold their beliefs passionately while simultaneously remaining curious about evidence that challenges those beliefs. Chapter 3: How Certainty Corrupts Political Judgment. Take a moment to examine your own political convictions. How many of them can you trace to careful consideration of empirical evidence, and how many derive from deeper commitments about how the world should be organized? I pose this question not to embarrass anyone, but to illustrate a fundamental feature of political life. Our judgments about specific policies inevitably reflect broader assumptions about human nature, social organization, and historical development that cannot themselves be empirically verified. This is not a criticism of political engagement, but a recognition of its inherent structure. Politics involves making decisions about the future based on incomplete information about the present and uncertain understanding of causal relationships. We cannot avoid bringing interpretive frameworks to this task. The question is whether we can remain aware of what we are doing, whether we can distinguish between the elements of our political position that rest on empirical evidence and those that rest on philosophical commitments. When we lose this distinction, several corruptions of political judgment become inevitable. First, we begin to treat empirical questions as if they were matters of philosophical principle. Whether a particular tax policy increases or decreases economic growth becomes a question of ideological loyalty rather than empirical investigation. We stop looking for evidence that might disconfirm our expectations and start looking for evidence that confirms what we already believe. Second, we begin to treat our political opponents as if they suffered from moral or intellectual defects rather than operating from different but potentially reasonable assumptions about complex realities. If our framework reveals the obvious truth about social questions, then those who disagree must be either ignorant or malicious. This transformation of political disagreement into moral judgment makes democratic persuasion impossible, since we can hardly hope to convince people we have already dismissed as morally or intellectually defective. Third, we lose the capacity for what we might call political learning, the ability to adjust our expectations and strategies based on the outcomes of previous policies. If our framework is essentially correct, then policy failures must result from inadequate implementation, external interference, or sabotaged by opponents rather than from flaws in our original analysis. We become incapable of the kind of feedback-based adjustment that allows political systems to improve their performance over time. Consider how these dynamics have shaped American debates about poverty policy over the past several decades. Both conservative and progressive frameworks contain insights about the causes of poverty and the likely effects of various interventions. Conservative emphasis on the importance of work, family stability, and personal responsibility captures real features of how people escape poverty. Progressive emphasis on structural barriers, inadequate opportunities, and the persistence of discrimination captures equally real features of how poverty persists despite individual effort. Yet when these insights become embedded in comprehensive ideological systems, they often become immune to empirical testing. Evidence that challenges one framework gets dismissed as reflecting the bias of the researchers or the inadequacy of the data rather than considered as potentially valuable information about the complexity of the phenomenon under investigation. Chapter 4: The Unintended Consequences of Good Intentions. One of the most sobering lessons from observing decades of social policy is how often well-intentioned interventions produce outcomes that their designers never anticipated and would never have desired. This pattern does not reflect the moral failings of policymakers or the impossibility of social improvement, but rather the irreducible complexity of social systems and the limitations of human foresight. Recognizing these limitations represents not an argument for paralysis, but a call for intellectual humility in the design and implementation of social policies. Consider the American experience with urban renewal in the 1950s and 1960s. The intention was admirable: to replace deteriorating urban neighborhoods with modern housing and infrastructure that would provide better living conditions for poor families. The planners possessed impressive technical expertise in architecture, engineering, and public administration. They had good reasons to believe that concentrated poverty in substandard housing contributed to a range of social problems. Their diagnosis of the problem was not unreasonable, nor were their proposed solutions obviously misguided. Yet the actual outcomes differed dramatically from the intended ones. The renewal projects often destroyed existing communities without replacing the social networks that had provided support for vulnerable families. They displaced small businesses and informal economic activities that had provided employment and services. They concentrated poor families in large-scale housing projects that became associated with crime, social isolation, and educational failure. Most tragically, they often worsened the conditions they had been designed to improve. These failures did not result from malicious intent or obvious incompetence, but from the impossibility of anticipating all the consequences of large-scale intervention in complex social systems. The planners could not foresee how their interventions would interact with other social processes, how people would adapt to the new conditions in ways that undermined the original objectives, or how political and economic changes would alter the context in which their projects operated. This pattern repeats itself across different policy domains and historical periods. Educational reforms designed to improve student achievement sometimes create perverse incentives that lead teachers to focus on test preparation at the expense of actual learning. Environmental regulations intended to protect ecosystems sometimes shift harmful activities to other locations or create new forms of environmental damage. Economic policies designed to help particular groups sometimes benefit other groups more or create market distortions that harm the intended beneficiaries. The appropriate response to this pattern is not cynicism about the possibility of social improvement, but rather a commitment to designing policies that can adapt as we learn about their actual effects. This requires building feedback mechanisms into policy design, conducting rigorous evaluation of outcomes, and maintaining the political flexibility to modify or abandon approaches that are not working as intended. Most importantly, it requires cultivating the intellectual virtue of holding our policy prescriptions lightly enough that we can modify them when evidence suggests they are not working. while holding our underlying values strongly enough that we continue trying to address the problems that concern us. This combination of passionate commitment to goals with intellectual flexibility about means represents one of the highest achievements of democratic political culture. Chapter 5: Cultivating Democratic Intellectual Virtues. How might citizens in a democracy cultivate the intellectual habits that allow them to engage seriously with political questions while avoiding the trap of premature certainty? This question has practical urgency in contemporary America, where political discourse often seems to reward the most extreme and confident positions rather than the most thoughtful and nuanced ones. The challenge is to develop forms of civic education that prepare people for the demands of democratic citizenship without encouraging either cynical disengagement or dogmatic partisanship. The first requirement is developing what we might call epistemic self-awareness, consciousness of the sources and limitations of our own knowledge. This involves learning to distinguish between what we know through direct experience, what we know through credible testimony from others, what we believe based on reasonable inference from available evidence, and what we hope or fear might be true based on our values and commitments. Democratic citizens need to be able to trace their political convictions back to their sources and to acknowledge when those convictions rest more on philosophical commitments than on empirical evidence. Consider how this might change the character of political conversation. Instead of asserting that tax cuts always stimulate economic growth or government spending always creates jobs, citizens might learn to say things like, "I believe tax cuts are likely to stimulate growth under current conditions based on this economic analysis, though I recognize that other credible analyses reach different conclusions," or, "My support for this spending program reflects both my belief that it will create jobs and my conviction that government has an obligation to provide employment during economic downturns, even if the evidence about job creation is mixed." Such statements might seem less forceful than categorical assertions, but they actually enable more productive political debate. They identify the specific points where empirical evidence might be relevant to resolving disagreements, and they acknowledge the role of values and philosophical commitments in shaping political positions. They treat political opponents as people who might have access to relevant evidence or reasonable alternative interpretations rather than as enemies to be defeated. The second requirement is developing comfort with what philosophers call cognitive pluralism, the recognition that complex social phenomena can often be accurately described from multiple perspectives without any single perspective providing a complete account. Economic inequality, for instance, can be accurately described as reflecting differences in individual effort and talent, as resulting from structural features of labor markets, as perpetuating historical patterns of discrimination, and as serving certain social functions while creating others' problems. These descriptions are not necessarily contradictory, they may capture different aspects of a complex reality. Citizens who can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously are better equipped to design policies that address the legitimate concerns raised by different viewpoints. They are also less likely to dismiss empirical evidence that challenges their preferred perspective or to assume that political opponents are motivated by malice rather than reasonable alternative interpretations of complex evidence. The third requirement is developing what John Dewey called experimental intelligence, the habit of treating political policies as hypotheses to be tested through experience rather than as deductions from eternal principles. This involves supporting policies not because they follow logically from our ideological commitments, but because we have good reasons to believe they will produce outcomes we value, while remaining open to modifying or abandoning them if experience suggests they are not working as intended. Chapter 6: Learning from International Democratic Experience. American political discourse often proceeds as if the United States were the only democracy in the world, or as if other democratic societies had nothing to teach us about managing the tensions between effective governance and popular accountability. This insularity deprives us of valuable perspective on our own institutions and practices. Examining how other democratic societies handle similar challenges can help us distinguish between problems that are inherent to democratic governance and those that reflect particular features of American political culture or institutional design. Consider how different democratic societies manage the relationship between expertise and popular sovereignty, one of the most fundamental tensions in democratic governance. Citizens cannot be expected to master the technical details of every policy question, yet democratic legitimacy requires that important decisions ultimately rest on popular consent. How do functioning democracies bridge this gap between the need for specialized knowledge and the requirement of popular control? The German model emphasizes institutional mechanisms that bring expert knowledge into democratic deliberation without allowing technocrats to bypass popular accountability. The Bundesbank's independence in monetary policy, for instance, reflects recognition that certain decisions require specialized expertise and insulation from short-term political pressures, but this independence operates within clear legal frameworks established through democratic processes. German environmental policy relies heavily on expert advisory councils, but these councils' recommendations must still be implemented through normal legislative processes. The Scandinavian approach emphasizes consensus-building institutions that allow different social groups to negotiate agreements based on shared access to expert analysis. Labor, business, and government representatives regularly participate in corporatist institutions that commission independent research on economic and social questions, then use this research as the basis for negotiating policies that all parties can accept. This model reduces the tendency for expert knowledge to become a weapon in partisan conflict by ensuring that all major stakeholders have access to the same information. The Swiss model of direct democracy provides yet another approach, using referenda and citizen initiatives to ensure that expert-designed policies must ultimately gain popular approval. This system forces political elites to explain complex policy proposals in terms that ordinary citizens can understand and evaluate, while giving citizens direct experience in grappling with difficult trade-offs rather than simply choosing between competing teams of politicians. None of these models provides a perfect solution to the tension between expertise and democracy, and none could be transplanted wholesale into the American context without substantial modification. But studying how other societies manage this tension can help us recognize that American practices, such as the extreme politicization of expertise or the tendency to treat technical questions as matters of partisan loyalty, are not inevitable features of democratic governance. Similarly, examining how other democratic societies handle political communication can provide perspective on contemporary American debates about media, information, and political discourse. Many European democracies maintain public broadcasting systems that provide high-quality news and analysis without commercial pressure to sensationalize or oversimplify complex issues. These systems are not immune to political pressure, but they create space for the kind of sustained, nuanced discussion of public issues that commercial media often cannot provide. Other democracies have experimented with different approaches to campaign finance, electoral systems, and civic education that might address some of the pathologies that Americans tend to treat as natural features of democratic politics. Proportional representation systems, for instance, tend to encourage coalition building and compromise rather than winner-take-all competition. Public campaign financing reduces the influence of wealthy donors while ensuring that candidates have resources to communicate with voters. Chapter 7: The Practice of Democratic Wisdom. The ultimate test of democratic intellectual virtues is not whether they satisfy our theoretical preferences, but whether they enable democratic societies to address serious problems while preserving the freedoms and institutions that make democratic life possible. This practical test requires us to move beyond abstract discussions of epistemology and political theory to consider how citizens might actually embody these virtues in their daily engagement with political questions. Democratic wisdom begins with recognizing that political questions typically involve trade-offs rather than simple choices between good and evil. Supporting higher minimum wages might help low-income workers while potentially reducing employment opportunities for the least skilled. Stricter environmental regulations might protect public health while imposing costs on businesses and their employees. More generous immigration policies might reflect humanitarian values while creating labor market competition for native-born workers. Acknowledging these trade-offs does not paralyze action, but it does require accepting that any policy choice will involve costs as well as benefits. Citizens practicing democratic wisdom learn to ask not which policy is morally superior, but which policy seems most likely to produce the outcomes we value, given our current understanding of the situation and the resources available to us. This reframing transforms political debate from moral combat into empirical inquiry, making it possible for people with different values to cooperate in evaluating evidence and learning from experience. Consider how this approach might change debates about criminal justice policy. Instead of arguing about whether society should prioritize punishment or rehabilitation, a debate that often generates more heat than light, democratic wisdom suggests focusing on empirical questions about which approaches actually reduce crime, protect public safety, and help offenders become productive citizens. This shift does not eliminate value disagreements, but it creates space for evidence-based learning that can improve policy outcomes regardless of one's underlying philosophy of criminal justice. Democratic wisdom also requires developing comfort with incrementalism and experimentation rather than demanding comprehensive solutions to complex problems. This preference for gradual change reflects not timidity or lack of ambition, but recognition that large-scale social interventions often produce unintended consequences and that we learn more effectively from smaller experiments that can be evaluated and modified based on their results. The practice of democratic wisdom involves cultivating what we might call political patience, the ability to work for long-term improvements while accepting that meaningful change often occurs slowly and through processes that require sustained effort across multiple electoral cycles. This patience reflects not resignation but rather realistic understanding of how democratic institutions actually function and change. Perhaps most importantly, democratic wisdom requires maintaining hope in the possibility of progress while avoiding the utopianism that leads to dangerous shortcuts around democratic constraints. Democratic societies can address serious problems and improve the lives of their citizens, but they do so through messy, contentious processes that require time, compromise, and continuous adjustment. Citizens who understand and accept these constraints are more likely to contribute constructively to democratic governance than those who become frustrated with the inevitable limitations of democratic processes. The cultivation of democratic wisdom is itself a democratic project, requiring institutions and practices that encourage these intellectual virtues while discouraging their opposites. This is perhaps the greatest challenge facing contemporary American democracy, creating conditions under which citizens can develop and practice the intellectual habits that democratic governance requires. Conclusion. The defense of doubt over certainty in political life is not an argument for relativism or paralysis, but for intellectual honesty about the complexity of social reality and the limitations of human knowledge. Democratic societies thrive when their citizens can distinguish between what they know and what they believe, when they can hold their convictions passionately while remaining curious about evidence that challenges those convictions, and when they can work together to address common problems despite disagreeing about fundamental questions of value and interpretation. These intellectual virtues are not merely academic preferences but practical necessities for societies that aspire to govern themselves wisely. In our current moment of political polarization and epistemic crisis, cultivating such virtues may be the most important civic duty we can perform. The alternative, societies organized around competing certainties, each immunized against evidence and correction, leads not toward truth or justice, but toward the kind of ideological rigidity that threatens democratic life itself.